Welcome back, everyone. Here we are again with one of our favorite guests, Professor Gerald Horne, and here to provide a bit of an update and discussion about recent political events in the U.S. and elsewhere. Thank you for coming on again, Gerald.
Thank you for inviting me.
Our pleasure, our pleasure. So I guess we should start off with what are your thoughts? What is your assessment of the state of U.S. politics now? I know it's a very broad question, but uh, what do you see the kind of near term and medium term possibilities for politics in the U.S.? How do you assess the incoming Trump 2 administration?
Well, generally speaking, it's disastrous. It's catastrophic. I find, to speak in simplistic terms, but not in inaccurate terms, there's a lot of anger in the Black community, a lot of fury. I mean, it's not as if they're angry about Harris losing, they're angry about Trump winning and what that says. Because the Black community voted against him rather heavily. Black women 9-1, despite all the propaganda and the blather. Black men 8-2. And we know that Mr. Trump is a very vengeful person. And we expect retribution, which, of course, has been a major theme of US politics for decades. That's why there's so many Black people on death row and so many Black people in prison. And amongst the Euro-American population, which I've started calling the settler descendant population, even amongst those of the left, I find it either an attempt to rationalize or justify, more so than anger, which I don't find surprising either. Now, the good news is that the progressive forces in this country, the radical forces, the anti-fascist forces, are very good fighting defensively. That's our stock and trade. We're like a football team that's strong defensively, but we're not very good offensively because, in part, the folks with whom we share a trench, we don't necessarily have common objectives going forward. Although we do have a common objective in terms of slowing down the Trump machine. And for particular, these mass deportations, which are in motion and may be launched as soon as 6 weeks from today. And this is very serious. It's going to disrupt families, particularly Haitian families, Mexican families. On the other hand, of course, it opens up opportunities for global cooperation with the Mexican government in particular, a nation 130 million strong, with positive relations with China and Russia and Cuba, too, by the way. The problem there is that a good deal of our leadership doesn't think internationally. They don't think beyond the four corners of the United States of America, which is a losing strategy. So, in sum, I would say that we're facing a catastrophe, but there's a glimmer of hope because our side is very good at fighting defensively.
Mm. Like the whole NFL this year, it seems.
Right,
Defense is
exactly.
Yeah, just
Yeah,
one
that's
quick
that.
follow-up. And then Kareem has a question that's related as well. But I'm just wondering, when I left the US in 2017, it was right after the airport protests against the Muslim ban. And I was
Mhm.
thinking, oh, great. Like all of these liberals whose information diet is, mass liberal media, they're going to be on the left side now. It's going to be like the George W. Bush administration. We're going to be protesting US foreign policy and the liberals are going to join in because the Republicans have the White House. But then when I left, it seemed like the liberal population in the U.S. that has that mass liberal media diet instead got sucked down into the Russiagate rabbit hole and didn't seem to be able to put up much of a fight against Trump's foreign policy. Do you see anything like that happening, or do you think these kinds of Russiagate distractions have run their course and now the kind of liberal population is going to be joining with the left to fight against the deportation plan and U.S. foreign policy under Trump.
What's a mixed bag? I mean, certainly I expect a lot of organizing from our liberal friends on the anti-deportation front, because it's an issue that plays to their strength, which is litigation going into
Mm.
court, and plays to their sentiments, which of course is going into court as well. There are some disturbing signs as well. Speaking of the liberal media, MSNBC, which Trump calls MSDNC, Democratic National Committee, they have these anti-Trump or erstwhile anti-Trump hosts, Joe Scarborough, former Republican Party congressman, and his partner, Mika Brzezinski, the daughter of the late hawkish National Security Advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski. And before November 5th, they were beating the drums against Trump. And part of it was personal, because as it has been his tendency, Mr. Trump has insulted her in very unpleasant terms. But we read in the paper today that they're suing for peace. They just visited Mar-a-Lago and probably will be walking back all of their criticism, which actually it's bigger than these two individuals, even though they are major media figures, because MSNBC and a good deal of the corporate media, their whole approach has been to build bridges to the Never Trump crowd. And Joe Scarborough is an exemplar of the Never Trump crowd. And if, I'm afraid to say that Vice President Harris picked up that tendency when she campaigned with Liz Cheney, the hawkish daughter of hawkish former Vice President and Pentagon Chief Dick Cheney. The problem with the Never Trump crowd is they have no base. I mean, as the saying goes, they barely have enough folks to organize a dinner party, let alone a political party. And so this is not a positive sign. I mean, obviously, MSNBC, if they were really serious, they need to be building bridges, not to the Never Trump crowd, but to the folks left of liberalism. But that seems to be beyond the ken of the liberal media, the corporate media. And I include in this not only the New York Times, of course, but you probably heard the news about how Jeff Bezos, the controlling owner of the Washington Post, he refused to have his newspaper give an endorsement, even though most of his columnists spent day after day pummeling Mr. Trump. And they have this motto on the front page every day: democracy dies in darkness. I thought that was a motto meant to inspire, not a charge that they should allow democracy to die in darkness. And Patrick Chung, I think that's his name. He's the controlling owner of the Los Angeles Times. He refused to give an endorsement as well. And of course, he has business with the Food and Drug Administration, now to be headed, we think, by the 70-year-old man with the worm in his brain, speaking of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Jeff Bezos is competing with first buddy Elon Musk in the space race. His company is Blue Origin. He's been losing contracts from the federal government because of the profit center of Amazon, Bezos's chief business, is really AWS, which sells excess cloud services, as they say. And the government is a major purchaser of cloud services, and he's been losing those contracts. So I guess he decided that the better part of wisdom was to kiss and make up with Mr. Trump. So we don't expect the corporate media to be exemplars of profiles and courage, but I don't think anybody really expected that in the first instance. So once again, to conclude, it's a mixed bag. I mean, we have a good defensive team, but overall, it's catastrophic.
Mm.
Yeah, and that bad or talking about defense. I also see that in the, and this is a very different topic in that sense, but I also see it in the pro-Palestinian discourse. They're very good at defending against all the accusations from Israel, but somehow they just don't go on the offense, which is much easier because you can literally accuse Israel of everything that it's accusing the Palestinian side of. I've always been very, very bothered by that.
I think he
But
froze.
pardon?
Oh,
Sorry, I didn't hear it.
I think you
I think
froze for a second.
Oh, oh, oh. Um, you guys can see me again, or?
Yes, at
All
least on
right,
my end.
great.
Yeah.
So you were talking about the left not cooperating well, especially on the international front, and I totally agree with you. And I wanted to touch on something that you have often highlighted, and that is something that you can put very well under words. That has frustrated me, but I find it harder to put under word. And that is your observation that the left is often very preoccupied with woke. So we're talking about the left the left the left's lack of cooperation, and instead of, you always put it very well under words, that instead of spending their energy on things that are much more pressing, they spend a lot of their energy on challenging woke and complaining about woke. And I find it always very, very frustrating to see, especially when I see older white leftists complain about that. I'm always wondering, why is especially this aspect so important for you to focus your energy on? And an example is that one of the interviews I saw with Norman Finkelstein or with Jared Ball. I'm gonna put a link in the description for people to see. Personally, I found that a very very unflattering interview of Norman Finkelstein that really made me think and rethink a lot of things. But I let people judge for themselves. But before I talk too much, what do you think about this, Gerald? Where does this come from? Do you also think that this is a kind of a weird preoccupation of the left that could be spent otherwise, and why so?
well, it's not only weird, it's dangerous. The Wall Street Journal reported just a few days ago that the incoming Secretary of Defense, Mr. Hegseth, who, as you know, has a Crusader Islamophobic tattoo on his torso, one of his pledges is to purge the U.S. military of so-called woke generals. And I dare say that that'll facilitate the non-woke or anti-woke generals saluting and executing when it comes to enforcing putatively unconstitutional orders to interfere in domestic politics, for example. This is quite ominous. It's quite dangerous, which makes it all the more upsetting that some of our so-called friends on the left, they're adding fuel to the flames by complaining themselves about wokeness. Now, one of the issues is I'm not even sure what that means. I mean, is it anti-racism? Is it they're opposed to anti-sexism? I think the issue may be that the Republicans got a lot of mileage out of bashing the transgender community, but it's not fashionable, at least thus far, for folks on the left side of the equation to come out and likewise denounce the transgender community because it's a small community, besieged community, and it would seem as if it were the worst kind of bullying. Although the moderate congressman from Massachusetts, Seth Moulton, Moulton, he has broken ranks and denounced the transgender community. And the Republican ads and rhetoric was very demagogic. I mean, it's hard for me not to chuckle when I recount it. I mean, Mr. Trump said, you send your little boy to school in the morning, and then he comes back in the afternoon as a little girl because the school executes an operation.
Hmm.
People, as they say, the low information voters soak this sort of thing up. I mean, in Texas, for example, if you went to YouTube before November 5th, you were besieged. At least I was. Maybe it's because of my the algorithm to which I'm subjected. I was besieged with these ads bashing the transgender community, for example. I guess it was a special appeal to the people of Texas, which of course went for Trump overwhelmingly. And sad to say, Senator Bernie Sanders, a presidential hopeful, and in some ways the most important leader politically on the left, insofar as he ran a credible race for the White House and has an enormous number of followers, his diagnosis of November 5th was that the Democrats spent too much time on the question of identity politics. Another term, I'm not sure what it means.
Yeah, the
It
same
could
realm.
mean Black Lives Matter. You're not supposed to complain about getting shot down on the streets if you're Black, which happens all too frequently, as anybody follows politics knows. Obviously, he's not talking about Israel, a country based upon an exclusivist ethno-religious identity, sort of an exemplar of identity politics, if the term means anything. Of course, he used to live in Israel. He's not talking about whiteness, which is this constructed identity, as I pointed out in my book on the 16th century, that allowed those warring on the shores of Europe to rebrand themselves after they crossed the Atlantic into this militarized identity politics known as whiteness that was used as a sledgehammer against the indigenous population. And Bernie Sanders, he really should know better. I mean, what I find is almost astonishing is that this idea that there has been inattention to the class question in the United States. I mean, first of all, it obscures the point that those of us who are the descendants of the unpaid sector of the working class, speaking of the Black community, we did our duty. We voted against Mr. Trump 8-2 and 9-1. And if other demographics had voted like this class segment, the legatees of the enslaved population, Mr. Trump would be on his way to jail, not to the Oval Office. And even with regard to the non-Black sectors, you would think, especially for someone like Mr. Sanders, that in analyzing class politics, there'd be a reference to the Red Scare, the fact for 75 years or more, the U.S. has enacted a policy to squash left-leaning trade unions bent on uplifting the wages and working conditions of working class people. Or, for example, with regard to this key issue of deindustrialization, that is to say, factories leaving the United States for cheap labor across the Pacific, for example. Well, we know that when that policy was at its height, the U.S. ambassador to China, Leonard Woodcock, was a former president of the United Auto Workers. And so, to a certain degree, the Trump base, the disgruntled working class elements in particular, they're complaining against policies that they supported. For example, I mean, because many of them supported anti-communism. There's this new book, Blue Collar Empire, that goes into how the labor movement was determined to squash left-leaning trade unions all over the world. And in my book on Southern Africa, for example, I talk about the Portuguese Revolution, April 1974, which opens the door to the liberation of South Africa, Namibia, Angola, Mozambique, et cetera. And the CIA was determined to reverse the events in Portugal. And they were ready to throw in the towel and surrender. And it's the AFL-CIO, or the AFL-CIA, as it's sometimes called, that basically tells the CIA, man up, you know, this battle is not over. They were determined to reverse the transformation in Portugal. So you would think that in doing an analysis of working class politics, that someone presumably as well informed as Mr. Sanders. After all, he's 83 years old. So he lived through a number of these events. I assumed he was keeping up with what was going on. You would think he would have a more sophisticated analysis, but alas, he does not. And then, of course, there's this opposition to diversity, equity, and inclusion, to so-called critical race theory, which most people can't define. It's rather esoteric approach that comes out of law schools. And although if you listen to the Republicans, it's used in kindergarten and first grade. So instead of trying to expose the demagogy of the right wing, many of our friends on the left have basically echoed the demagogy or surrendered to the demagogy. And I think this is one of the reasons why you find so much anger in the Black community nowadays, because instead of giving us some sort of analysis of how we got to this precipice of disaster, many of our friends on the left are in a sense justifying. They're rationalizing. They're throwing dust in our eyes. And it's quite alarming, I must say.
Yeah, people say that Sanders is quite old, but he hasn't lost a step. But when I heard that he had joined the chorus of "Oh God, identity politics hurt us," I was like, "Dude, that's from 2016. That's maybe from 2020." And it's so good to bring up how nebulous these terms, identity politics and woke, are, because they have so many different definitions for different people. Which is why I try to introduce into the English language this Chinese term, Baizoa, which literally means white left, but it's used to refer to people in the West, in Europe and in the U.S., without regard to melanin levels, people who think of themselves on the left, but they focus their attention exclusively on social issues like trans rights or gay rights or whatever the case may be. But the key part about the definition is they don't focus on imperialism or capitalism, the two traditional focuses of the left for the past century, maybe two. So this term, I'm really trying to get into the English language because it's clear, whereas woke has so many different meanings. Like originally, it would be the opposite of Baizoa. But now the way it's used, for some people, it has the same meaning as Baizoa. So that's why I'm trying to push this. But I've noticed a lot of people on the right of the Democratic Party come out with this. Oh, we were too woke. We used too much identity politics, blah, blah, blah. On MSNBC, I've seen it. On Fox election night, they were saying it, of course. But a lot of figures on the right of the Democratic Party are pushing this. And comedians in the US, I think, have had some of the best responses so far, pointing out, what are you talking about? The Harris campaign didn't run on anything Baizoa or quote unquote woke. They ran away from that. Maybe in 2020, they put a few Instagram posts supporting the BLM protests, which they had no real, true affinity for, true support for. But it's such an anachronism to say that identity politics are woke, however you're defining that, was a theme that the Democrats ran on. I mean, I wasn't in the country. You were in the country. Did you hear any Democrat run on quote unquote woke?
No, I mean, it's obviously ridiculous. I mean, even if you go back and look at the press, the mainstream press was somewhat baffled by the fact that Vice President Harris steered clear, for the most part, of possibly being the first Black woman president, or possibly being the first woman president, et cetera. So it reminds me of 2016. If you go back and look at the New York Times after the Trump victory, you'll see this professor at Columbia, Mark Lilla, Lilla. He writes this opinion piece that lays out the terms concerning so-called identity politics, and that's the reason why Trump won. Because the Euro-American working class, they get so upset with identity politics that he has blindly pulled the lever in favor of the Republicans. No reference to the Red Scare, no reference to squashing of left-wing trade unions or anything of that sort. It's just identity politics. And then this black woman, leading black woman scholar, Nell Irvin Painter, she gave a much more sophisticated analysis with regard to whiteness, white supremacy, et cetera. It didn't go anywhere. As a matter of fact, she retired from the academy shortly thereafter. So this is where we are right now, and it's quite alarming.
Yeah, I notice a specific trend when it comes to this whole woke debate. And as a social psychologist, I'm always interested in the motivations behind people to really focus on these things. And in my opinion, when you look on the right, all the focus on woke is usually just a smokescreen for anything that how can I say that uh, harms the foundations of Euro-American hegemony. Let's put it that way, or it's threatening to white supremacy. Whether it's people of color in movies and video games, woke. Whether it's teachers that talk about issues of inequality, woke. Whether it's about Palestine, woke. Everything that is slightly threatening to the status quo is woke and is demonized as woke. The problem on the left, in my opinion, is that many of them try to analyze it way too intellectually. So the left has the tendency to go, and that's what they always do. That in the Netherlands, you see the same thing. There's this when for example an extreme right-wing racist party of Geert Wilders wins, then you have on the left you have people who deeply analyze why that is, because of all these structural problems and the rental prices are too high and this and that, even though the simple explanation is just a lot of people are racist, very simple, and his Islamophobia is just very popular. So when I see this discussion, for example, with people like Norman Finkelstein that go very deep into this question of woke and that deeply analyze it in a very leftist intellectual way, I have the feeling that it is actually over intellectualizing a phenomenon that is just very simply explained by a resistance to those who try to overthrow the status quo. You know what I mean? And I find I cannot speak for people like Norman Finkelstein. Like, why do you spend your energy, even a book, on this question, when there are so much more pressing matters when it comes to identity? You know what I mean? If you're so bothered by the fact that there are, in his opinion, identity reasons for why, for example, certain people are hired and other people are not, instead of focusing on the structural questions of inequality, then I wonder, like, why are you not focused on the identity reasons that people vote for Trump, or the identity reasons why more white university professors are still overly represented in academia, for example? What do you think about that,
Well,
Professor Horne?
sure. I mean, to go back to Bernie, and I prefer to focus on Bernie because he's a powerful political figure, and Congress has run for president and has gotten millions of votes. So he wrote this piece in the Boston Globe right after the election. He laid out this working class agenda, which was right on. It was a good agenda. But the Republicans blocked the agenda. The Republicans, in turn, are backed by a goodly number of white working class elements. And he doesn't seem to acknowledge that. I mean, he must know that. And then it makes me wonder, why should we follow a guy who's so out of touch, who's apparently out of touch with reality? And of course, Mr. Sanders has been criticized repeatedly for his weaknesses, which is not his alone, with regard to anti-racism, which was rather astonishing in a country built upon mass enslavement of Africans and dispossession of the indigenous. And our Tribune is weak on that front. I mean, it's enough to give you a nervous breakdown. But then again, Mr. Sanders, although it's not oftentimes acknowledged, he comes out of this anti-communist socialist tradition. The grand old man of U.S. socialism was Norman Thomas, who, of course, was anti-communist. You know, most of these socialists, for example, uh, they backed the anti-Soviet entente with China that led, as I said, to this massive outflow of jobs across the Pacific that's now created this juggernaut. And rather than going back and critiquing the policy that led to this phenomenon, they act like it didn't happen. I mean, which makes them quite vulnerable to Mr. Trump's strategy, which is the new Cold War, focus like a laser beam on China. And just as a footnote, I don't think that strategy is going to work because it's dependent, not least, upon currying favor with Moscow, just as the United States 50 years ago curried favor with China. But why should Moscow turn against its neighbor with which it shares a lengthy border and has a bountiful, fruitful trade relationship, which has led to its economic growth this year, 3.5, outstripping much of that of its neighbors to the West, particularly when we know that in 2028, it's not unlikely that the Democrats will return to power, will reverse the entente that Trump has engineered with Moscow, and will go back to double containment. That is to say, containing Russia and China simultaneously. So, you know, I guess if you to be objective is that despite all of the bombast and the beating your chest, U.S. imperialism is rather trapped right now, and it really has no answer for the BRICS. It has no answer with regard to impending de-dollarization. It has no answer for digital currencies, which are the new rage, which inevitably will have impact on King Dollar. And so perhaps in that context, it's understandable why there's this focus on wokeness, DEI, CRT, et cetera, because that way you can at least beat up on these defenseless minorities. And of course, it gives you historical momentum too, since the country was constructed upon that premise. And you don't have to deal with all of these issues I just referenced, which are quite formidable and are quite fearsome.
Yeah, it's a great illustration of that point, the U.S. being unable to deal with China's developmental foreign policy. There was an announcement, Blinken put an American flag on an old diesel train that was being replaced, I think somewhere in California, somewhere in the U.S., with an electric train. And then he tried to make this big announcement, like, we're giving this wonderful train to Peru. So we're competing with China in the Belt and Road Initiative by basically just giving our used decades old technology train to Peru. Meanwhile, China is building, modern high-speed rail in many places in the world. But it was such a great illustration of the bankruptcy of the U.S. empire's answer to China's foreign policy right now. I don't see. How do you see Trump trying to address that? I mean, I just don't even see an attempted response.
Well, Mr. Biden just put a spanner in the works by allowing the so-called attack missiles to be shot more deeply into Russia, which could precipitate World War III. And it's really a booby trap for the incoming Trump administration. That is to say, he's supposedly going to try to build an entente with Russia as the United States is supplying Ukraine with missiles to shoot deeply into Russia, which of course is also a signal to Russia about the instability of the U.S. ruling class, that you can cut a deal with the Trump wing, but a few years later, it'll be overturned by the Democrats. Not to mention the fact that Russophobia is so deeply embedded in this country. It's quite astonishing that it's going to complicate enormously the ability of the Trump team to go in a different direction. Now, of course, just briefly, the roots not only go back to the Soviet era and Soviet disruption of the cash cow of colonialism and neocolonialism. By the way, I just screened this film that I recommend, Soundtrack to a Coup d'etat, which deals with the killing of Patrice Lumumba, the first leader of independent Congo circa 1961. And on the point we're now addressing, the Soviets were bashing the United States at the United Nations about their direct role in killing Lumumba. And then, of course, to go back even further, during the U.S. Civil War, Russia sent fleets to the Pacific coast and the Atlantic coast to support the Lincoln government, which outrages the enslaving class, and the descendants of the enslaving class are still, to put it euphemistically, quite influential in this country. And going back a few decades earlier, of course, with the War of 1812, you saw the enslaved population defect in the thousands to the British side. Britain had invaded the United States and escape on British ships. Russia's chosen to mediate between London and Washington with regard to compensating the slave owners. I thought that actually Russia gave the slave owners a good deal, but they didn't agree, and that helps to engender Russophobia. So in any case, the United States is sort of stuck right now, and the bombast of Mr. Trump cannot obscure that. And with regard to this question of some of the ideological weaknesses of our liberal friends, you may want to see this op-ed in the New York Times by Thomas Frank. He wrote this book a few years ago, What's the Matter with Kansas?, where he said that the right wing, they dangle these culture war issues like abortion before the Euro-American electorate, and they go for the bait, and then when they get into office, they enact tax cuts for the wealthy. He downplays the question of racism, although, of course, those of us who know a bit about Kansas, such as myself, realize that the Supreme Court case that led to the overthrow juridically of U.S. apartheid comes out of Kansas, Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, for example. Not to mention the fact that you have these large Black populations in Kansas City, Kansas, Kansas City, Missouri, right across the border. So, like I said, some of these folks, you wonder, what planet are they living in? I mean, or are they so bent on putting forward a theory that they're like the fictional French intellectual who says, I know what you're saying is true in fact. The question is it true in theory? In other words, theory has to be in the forefront and damn the facts. But in any case, his op-ed says the elites had it coming with regard to the election. And that's, of course, this mythology that the Democrats are the elites. I guess the Republicans led by a billionaire.
Yeah, exactly.
They're not elites, supported by Steve Schwarzman, who, of course, invests heavily in China, by the way, particularly higher education on the mainland. Another billionaire, he's not an elite, big supporter of Trump. Elon Musk, also heavily invested in China. He's not an elite. And as I said, you wonder, are these people, are they that out of touch? And I guess the answer is yes.
Yeah, yeah, and that really touches also on the debate about anti-wokeness. It's these ridiculous analyses of things that show a kind of blind spot. It seems it's so frustrating. And then saying that's why I just recently published a new article in one of the journals in my field, and I also said, in which I also write that right-wing populism is not, which is often framed as anti-elitism, even in academic books that we read. And I always say you can make it much simpler, and it's what I always say, selective anti-elitism. So, in other words, it's a certain elite, and it's the elite that is considered on the other side of the political spectrum. But in the end, they're all elites. It's just an inter-elite kind of competition. The Democrats versus the Republicans, and that's it. I mean, billionaires here, billionaires there. What's the difference? What's the difference? You know what I mean? Anyway,
Mhm.
Peter, you wanted to ask a question?
Well, I think we've got time to shift our focus a little bit. Uh, what do you see? I mean, there's been so much talk about what the new Trump administration will do regarding U.S. policy towards Palestine and Israel. He's made a number of appointments to his cabinet that are staunchly pro-Israeli government. But then you had some Trump supporters before the election saying, "Oh, Trump is going to be the peace candidate. He's gonna wrap up all these wars." Uh, Given that we now have a better sense of the people he's going to bring into his administration, and since personnel is policy, or at least under normal administrations, personnel is policy. Who knows with Trump? What do you think the U.S. Policy is going to be come January towards the genocide in Palestine? Do you have any? Do you think it's clear or clear enough to see, or is it still very much up in the air because of Trump's mercurial personality and lack of a deep-seated ideology?
Well, first of all, let me echo the disappointment with regard to some of our friends who swallowed whole the propaganda that Mr. Trump put forward that he believes in ending wars, not starting them or continuing them. I mean, people are, well, fortunately, there are some people who are apologetic, which is good because that's not common in this country to admit a mistake. So that's a good sign. We even see it with regard to some people, ordinary working class people who are seeking to this absent process of revoking their votes. Because, I mean, once you cast your vote, that's it. And of course, this is particularly the case in Michigan, where Trump won Dearborn, Michigan, which is a heavily Arab American community. Now, fortunately, the Green candidate got 19%. She didn't do that well, perhaps in any other node of this country, because she got 0.5% nationally. So to get 19% in Dearborn is astonishing. Yet Mr. Trump won Dearborn, 43%, for example. And I'm sure many of the folks who voted for him, they swallowed the propaganda. Now they get an Islamophobic crusader to lead the U.S. military. I mean, what a boomerang. But with regard to West Asia, I'm not really sure because U.S. imperialism has so much capital tied up in that part of the world. And the Saudis are under pressure. They accepted an invitation to the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, then apparently reneged. They've been having high-level discussions with the Iranians, the ostensible target of a Trump-Israel attack. U.S. vessels has not gotten that much publicity. They've been under assault in the Red Sea by the folks referred to as the Houthis from Yemen, Al-Ansar. So Trump likes to be mercurial and unpredictable, as you said, and the situation right now in West Asia is made to order for unpredictability, particularly since there have been all these assaults on Mr. Netanyahu's residences lately, more scandals erupting. It would not surprise me at all if he were subject to some sort of palace coup or worse, for example, as a prelude to at least a temporary course correction. It reminds me of what happened in January 1981, when on the day Ronald Reagan was inaugurated, those who had been detained in the U.S. Embassy in Iran were released. And it was a major psychological blow in favor of Mr. Reagan. It was obviously the product of some hanky-panky between some of the October surprise team of Mr. Reagan and some of the Iranians, for example. So it wouldn't surprise me that if in January 2025, there is some announcement of steps towards peace, for example. I'm not sure how seriously that should be taken. I'm not sure if it would be little more than a sugar high to give a kind of jolt to the naive U.S. electorate, some of our friends in Dearborn, for example, that could then be quickly reversed. So I guess what I'm saying is I'm not really sure what the Trump policy will be towards West Asia, although I'm willing to accept that given his funding by Miriam Adelson, the billionaire casino magnate, who of course too has interests in China and Macau, and she funds Netanyahu as well, given the fact that his in-laws, the Kushners, are prominent Zionist backers. Thomas Friedman of the New York Times had this article the other day where he was talking to people in historic Palestine, and the Israeli Jewish population was saying, the Kushners, we're good as gold because they're going to influence Trump. And then some of the Arabs were looking at the new in-laws of Tiffany Trump, the Lebanese family, Boulos family, a billionaire family with interests in Nigeria. And they were saying, we're good as gold because Boulos is going to influence Trump. And Thomas Friedman says, well, somebody's going to be disappointed. And the way U.S. imperialism is going right now, it wouldn't surprise me if both sides were disappointed. That is to say that the ultra-rightist, dare I say, fascist elements and the Netanyahu coalition, who are pushing for a total annexation of the West Bank, it's difficult, call me naive, but it's difficult for me to see that receiving that much backing from the White House. But, we'll see. And certainly, this idea of a two-state solution, it's been a dead man walking for years. The only question is, what's going to replace it? And to that, I have no answer.
Well, if I hear these people speak, not only the Crusader guy, but also Marco Rubio. Is this his name, Marco Rubio?
Narco Rubio.
Yeah. If you hear what he says about Palestinians, and if that is going to orbit around Trump, man, that's bad news for West Asia. That's bad news. But on the other hand, it can be so extreme that it's actually a reason for implosion. I don't know.
Well, it's not only narco, of course, because early in his career, his brother-in-law was peddling drugs out of the Rubio house, and Marco disclaimed any knowledge of that, although his brother-in-law did hard time, and so people started calling him Narco Rubio. But in any case, it's not only Narco Rubio, it's Congresswoman Stefanik, who's going to be the UN ambassador, who browbeat and hectored Ivy League university presidents because they were insufficiently enthusiastic about genocide in Palestine, causing Claudine Gay, the first Black woman president of Harvard, a descendant of Haitian refugees, to resign, for example. We mentioned the Crusader guy, as you put it. And then, of course, there's Mike Huckabee, the former Arkansas governor, his daughter, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, former spokesperson for Mr. Trump, now governor of Arkansas. He's the emblem of Christian Zionism. I won't repeat some of their cockamamie ideas with regard to Armageddon, how when Jesus returns, those who are chosen will rise to heaven and the rest of us will be damned. I mean, this is the guy. And then in the Wall Street Journal today, there's an article about the guy who's taking Jared Kushner's place as the Mideast negotiator, Steve Witkoff, uh, who is another affluent Zionist Jewish American businessman out of Florida and New York, for example. No diplomatic experience, of course. That's par for the course. But he's a deal maker. As the Wall Street Journal put it. So that's another idea that needs a sharp criticism, the idea that doing deals in Manhattan real estate qualifies you to do a deal. As Witkoff said, it's just another land deal. It's just another real estate deal. Big numbers, territory. What's the difference? Well, I think he's in for a rude awakening.
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah, that it really kind of leaves me speechless a bit. Certainly the personnel appointments have been they've confirmed my speculation in 2016 that Trump is going to be the right's Obama, in the sense that I remember very well in 2012 there were still some liberals, left of liberals, who thought that okay, first term Obama had his hands tied, second term he's really going to be able to do everything that he promised the first time. And again, that's what happened on the right with Trump. There are a few rightists who got permanently disappointed, just as there were a few leftists who were permanently disappointed by Obama's first term. But then you had plenty of people who are willing to believe that, oh yeah, the first time he wasn't prepared and he got snookered by all of these swamp creatures, but this time he knows the deal and he's really, so I don't know. I don't know what the question is here, other than to just vent my frustration at the state of U.S. politics. Is there anything you see that's in a more hopeful direction, like any sprouts here or there that could develop into something that would take U.S. politics out of this clusterfuck that we're in, it seems?
Well, I would like to say yes, although it's probably premature to do so. I will say this proposal that I've been floating about an emergency conference in either Ottawa, Canada, or Havana, Cuba, uh, with our friends in both neighboring countries. Of course, in Cuba, we received the assistance of the government because they're quite concerned about Mr. Rubio, given the fact that he's a hardcore anti-Fidelista. His family left Cuba before Fidel came to power, but it seems to have made no difference in terms of this hostility to that government. With the immediate issue for the conference being stopping the deportations, which would have damaging impact on Haiti and on Mexico in particular. And given the fact that there are legations of many of our would-be and potential allies in the Canadian capital, African allies, Latin American allies, particularly the government of Mexico. And so it's gotten a positive response, but positive response doesn't mean that it'll happen, because really to pull off something like this, you need the participation of either the labor movement or the NAACP, which is sort of the broad Black movement. And both are sort of scared of their shadows. So and of course, the AFL-CIO, as noted, is the AFL-CIA. I mean, they're in bed with the ruling class, so you can't expect them to do something as audacious as holding a conference abroad. So that is rather dampening. But on the other hand, I expect the international situation to open up many opportunities. The slapping of sanctions on Mexico is going to create enormous problems for the Trump team. Ditto for slapping of sanctions on the EU, on Canada, on China, for example. The problem that I see, and I don't know, sometimes I feel I'm sounding too pessimistic, is that things will get worse under Mr. Trump, but the rhetoric against migrants, against Black people, against the trans community will escalate nonetheless as things get worse. And that's a very combustible recipe. And that's what I'm afraid might happen.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I totally agree with that. And it's a scary time in that sense. I mean, we don't know what's going to happen both domestically and internationally with this new direction of the United States. Well, new direction. We can wonder if it's a new direction. It just goes increasingly extreme, whether it's the Democrats or the Republicans. Anyway, that was very, very good again, Professor Horne. We are already at the hour, so unfortunately we cannot get to the other part that we wanted to question you about, and that's the imperialism in Africa done by the Gulf and the other states in West Asia. So I hope you forgive us for asking you again in the near future to come again.
Oh, sure. Because all that means is that I'll have more information down the road than I have today.
Oh, great. Yeah, we definitely want. So when it happens next time, we're only going to focus on that topic because there's always so much to talk about with you. And before we know it, we're already at the hour. Anyway, thank you so much, Professor Horne, and we will look very much forward to seeing you again.
Yes, indeed.
Thank you for inviting me.